Hello, everyone. I'm Shiri Lev-Ari, and what I'm going to try to do today is show you why it's useful to take a social network perspective when we study language or cognition more generally. So when we talk about languages, whether it's English, Korean, or Hebrew, languages are basically communication systems that are used by communities. And these communities can differ from each other on different properties, such as how big they are, how diverse they are, how interconnected they are. And more than that, when we say that there's a community that speaks English, we don't mean that each and every person in the community speaks the same language, English, but each person actually has their own version of the language. So they might pronounce words differently, they might have different lexical choices and so forth. And more than that, a community is not just multiple people, but it's multiple people that are connected in a certain structure, such that each person is only exposed to some people and not others, meaning each person is only exposed to some versions of the language and not others, which is one of the reasons that each person also ends up having a different version of their language. So, what I'm going to try to do today is show you that when we take a social network perspective, first of all, it allows us to better understand individual differences in linguistic skills. I'm also going to show you that taking a social network perspective can help us predict whether the behavior of individuals can really cascade to the entire community. And lastly, a social network perspective can help us understand why different communities have different languages. So starting with individual linguistic skills, by now, we actually have quite a bit of evidence that people's own social network, such as different properties of these, such as their size, can influence how good they are at communication. And for the most part, it seems that having a larger social network, so regularly interacting with more people, leads people to have superior linguistic skills. So people with larger social networks are better at understanding evaluative language, and I'm going to explain what that means in a second. People with larger social networks are also better at speechy noise. They're also better at predicting what someone will say, and they're not only better at always understanding others, as I've shown you in all of these, but they're also better understood by others. That is, they're better at communicating and transmitting information. And even though for the most part, it seems that having a larger social network really leads to better linguistic skills, I actually have a recent study where I find that sometimes having a larger social network actually leads to poorer performance, for example, in the case of voice recognition, and probably because those with larger social networks are actually not as good at different tasks that require learning speaker-specific information rather than being able to generalize from one person to another. So to give you an example of one thing that people with larger social networks are better at, specifically evaluative language, evaluative language relates to cases like words such as excellent, great, horrible, good. So if you ask someone, for example, how was the movie, and they say great, then it's actually quite difficult to understand what they mean. For some people, great means really, really good. And for some people, great means something more similar to okay. And this is something very common about evaluative language, that different people use the same words to mean different levels of enthusiasm. In contrast, they use different words to mean the same level of enthusiasm. And the way we usually disambiguate what different words such as great means is by looking at them in their linguistic context. We try to see which other type of words occur with them. We try to see whether what type of speech style there is, how long the sentence is, how informal the speech is. And all these kind of things basically help us disambiguate the information. But importantly, in order to learn these co-occurrence patterns and in order to learn how to use the linguistic context to disambiguate the words, we actually have to have a larger social network, because it's only by interacting with multiple with multiple people that use the same words differently that we're really able to learn these patterns. And indeed, we found the case that people that have a larger social network in the real world are really better at understanding evaluative language, such as, for example, understanding restaurant reviews. And we also found experimentally that when we try to teach people novel evaluative words, they learn them better and are able to learn new reviewers better if they learn those words from large social networks compared to small ones. But learning these co-occurrence patterns is not the only benefit of having a larger social network. So having a larger social network across the other studies and skills that I've shown you is useful because having a larger social network means receiving greater input variability, because as we said, every person speaks a little differently. And in general, we know that receiving greater input variability leads to more robust learning. Now, having a larger social network also means receiving more representative input about the community. It also interacting with more people might also encourage people to take more perspective and therefore make them better at communication and so forth. So in addition to the fact that social network properties such as their size can influence people's linguistic skills, as I said beforehand, it can also influence to what degree the behavior of one person really cascades to the rest of the community. And we'll start with an example. Let's say you only know 2 people who are attending this conference and they both call it an online conference. Then you might think that this is the only appropriate way to refer to this conference. But then you meet a third person, and the third person calls this a virtual conference. Now you're going to adjust the representation and reach the conclusion that actually virtual conference is also a reasonable term for this conference, maybe not as common as online conference, but still appears about a third of the time. Now, let's say that instead of just knowing 2 people who attend this conference, you actually know quite a few of them, but they all call it an online conference. Again, you might meet someone new who's going to call it a virtual conference. This would lead you to adjust your representations, but this time, the adjustment is going to be much, much smaller. And the reason is that there's an inverse relationship between your sample size, so the number of speakers you regularly interact with, and the weight that you give each and every one of them. And this basically means that people that have a larger social network might be less malleable, so they'll be less vulnerable to the influence of each and every speaker they meet compared to people with smaller social network. And this is indeed what we found across quite a few studies. And this actually leads to the counterintuitive conclusion that if you want to spread something through the community, it's actually going to be, you're more likely to be able to do that if you manage to spread it via people who have a small social network. So they're actually much more important for the spread of information across the community. And we actually have computational simulations that show that. Now, social network size is not the only thing that matters. So something else that is really true about networks in the real world is that they're interconnected. So the people that we interact with also tend to know and interact with each other. And this means that the information that we get from different people might not be independent of each other. They might have heard it from each other or from the same other source. But it seems that people don't really take that into account when they learn information. They don't take into account the fact that the information is not independent of each other. And this actually means that information travels faster and is more likely to spread to the community in interconnected communities. And the last feature I want to talk about relates to the fact that we don't treat information the same way all the time. We actually pay much more attention and give much more weight to information that we learn from in-group members compared to out-group members. And this again can mean that if the community is composed of very large and inclusive social groups, then information would spread more quickly compared to if it's composed of multiple, more exclusive social groups. And lastly, as I said, social network properties can also influence what type of language the community creates. So in general, larger communities, but also more heterogeneous communities and sparser communities, they all have many more communicative challenges. So as I mentioned beforehand, each and every person has their own version of the language. This means that there's much more input variability in larger communities. In larger communities, you're also more likely to have to interact with someone that you've never interacted beforehand, and therefore that you have no shared history with. And more than that, those people that you never interacted with are also more likely to be more different from you. So they're more likely to not have the same general knowledge that you do. They may not come with the same expectations. And in general, it also takes much longer for information to travel inside larger communities. Now, all these are basically barriers for communication, and it's been suggested over the last decade that languages really adapt to the social needs. So that means that if larger communities have greater communicative challenges, the languages that those communities speak might adapt by becoming more robust against these challenges. So they might be easier to learn and to use and to communicate in. So to give you one example for a way in which languages can really become easier for use, I'm going to have you participate in 2 trials from one of my recent studies. So just like my participants, I'm going to play you a word, and I want you to guess whether it means big or small. So let's say you hear this word.
Badak.
Now, if you're similar to my participants, you might guess that these words mean big. And then you might hear this word.
Ndu.
Again, if you're similar to my participants, you might guess that these words mean small. And the idea is that the majority of participants agreed that badak means big and then do means small, is because there's something about the word that sounds like one of these meanings. And this idea that words sound like what they mean is sound symbolism. And it's been shown that sound symbolism really facilitates communication. So it facilitates language acquisition and it facilitates processing. So if we say that languages that are spoken by larger communities need more robust languages, then we might expect them to rely more on sound symbolism because it doesn't require any shared history or shared knowledge, and it fits with our cognitive biases and our intuitive guesses about the meaning of words. So in that case, it might be the case that the reason that you manage to guess the meaning of badak is because badak is a word in Sundanese, and Sundanese is a language spoken by 32 million people, so it has quite a large population of speakers. In contrast, if you guess that ndu means small, then you are wrong, like the majority of participants, because ndu actually means large or big. And the reason that, potentially the reason that people, that the word is less than symbolic of what it means is because ndu is actually a word in Yele, a language that is spoken by only 5,000 people. And indeed, if you look across the languages, which were 40 different languages from different families that I used in the study, then it really was the case that the larger the population of speakers who speak the language, the easier it was for participants to guess what the words mean, meaning the languages were more sound symbolic. And as I said, the idea is that what I'm suggesting is that the reason that languages spoken by larger communities are more sound symbolic is because those languages use sound symbolism as a tool to facilitate communication. And sound symbolism is not the only way that languages spoken by larger communities really become easier to learn and use. So previous studies have also shown that languages spoken by larger communities have less complex morphology, more systematic grammar. So this was actually initially shown by Lukian and Dell when they did a correlation across the world's languages, but it was also later on found experimentally in the lab. So to conclude, I hope that what you took from my talk is that it is really useful to think about network structure when we study language or individual and collective cognition more generally. So network structure really influences it leads to individual differences between people in their linguistic skills. It also influences language at the community level and also how the individual behavior really cascades and influences the language at the group level. And finally, I want to thank you for your attention and also mention the fact that I mentioned many studies, but of course I didn't conduct all of them in isolation, but I actually had many collaborators on these. So I want to both acknowledge them and thank them. So thank you.